The crystal chandeliers at the St. Regis Ballroom were vibrating from the bass of a string quartet that cost more than most people make in a year. My father stood at the head of the main table. His face flushed a deep, expensive shade of mahogany from the third bottle of vintage Bordeaux. It was the 30th anniversary of Sterling Holdings, the real estate empire he treated like a personal religion. I sat 3 seats down, nursing a glass of sparkling water, trying to blend into the velvet wallpaper. I had spent the last 6 months working 18-hour days behind the scenes, fixing his logistical nightmares and smoothing over the cracks in his increasingly erratic acquisitions, but tonight wasn't about the work. It was about the image. My father tapped his dessert spoon against his glass, a sharp crystalline sound that cut through the polite chatter of 300 investors, local politicians, and the city's social elite. He didn't just want their attention. He wanted their submission. He started with the usual platitudes about grit and determination, his voice booming with that practiced authority that had intimidated me for 25 years. Then, his eyes found mine, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from celebratory to predatory. He let out a wet, heavy laugh and leaned into the microphone, his grip tightening. He told the room that success is a lonely mountain, especially when you are carrying dead weight. He looked directly at me and called me a glorified charity case. The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. He told the crowd that I was a prime example of generational rot, a soft kid who had never known a day of real hunger, because his pockets were always lined with someone else's hard work. He said I would be living in a cardboard box on the corner of 4th and Main if it weren't for the trust fund he so graciously provided. I felt the heat of 300 pairs of eyes burning into my skin, waiting for me to shatter or run. My father wasn't done though. He announced with a wide, cruel smile that as of midnight, he was officially cutting me off from every family asset to toughen me up. He called it a lesson in reality, a way to see if I could survive without the Sterling name as a crutch. My stepmother chuckled into her silk napkin, and a few of his more sycophantic business partners joined in, treating my public execution like a clever bit of after-dinner entertainment. I didn't get up. I didn't shout. I just watched him, noticing the way his hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass for a final toast to his own brilliance. I thought about the 3 desperate phone calls I'd taken from his chief financial officer earlier that week. I thought about the delinquent notices sitting on my desk from creditors he didn't even know were closing in. He had spent so long convinced that his money was the only thing giving me value that he had completely blinded himself to the fact that my labor was the only thing keeping him solvent. He saw a son who was a burden. I saw a CEO who was drowning and just threw away his only life jacket. As he sat down to a round of applause, he leaned over and whispered that I should enjoy my last night of luxury because tomorrow I'd finally learn what it's like to have nothing. I just nodded and took a slow sip of my water, looking at the man who had just set his own house on fire while standing in the center of the living room. He thought he was cutting me off from his wealth. He didn't realize he was actually cutting himself off from his only lifeline. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring into long jagged streaks of neon against the rain-slicked window of the car service I'd paid for myself. My father's words were still echoing in the hollow space of my chest, but they didn't hurt the way he intended. They felt heavy like a lead weight but also strangely liberating. He spent his life obsessed with the roar of the engine, the size of the hull, and the prestige of the logo. To him, wealth was a performance, a loud, gaudy theater production where he was always the lead actor and I was just a prop he used to show off his supposed benevolence. He had spent the last decade buying yachts that depreciated the moment they hit the water, and funding a lifestyle that was more about ego than equity. While he was busy chasing the spotlight and demanding the world acknowledge his greatness, I had been working in the shadows, building something he couldn't even conceptualize. It started 5 years ago when I realized that his business model was a crumbling relic of the past. I didn't argue with him. You can't argue with a man who thinks his own breath is a gift to the atmosphere. Instead, I took the modest dividends from my mother's estate, money he couldn't touch, and began investing it in a rival tech-driven logistics firm called Viridian. I didn't use the Sterling name. I used a series of holding companies, and an alias that kept my identity buried under layers of digital paperwork. I wasn't just an investor. I became their silent architect. I spent my nights refining their algorithms and identifying the very weaknesses in sterling holdings that my father was too arrogant to see. While he was out at five-star dinners bragging about his empire, I was in a cramped home office earning equity in a company that was systematically disrupted his entire supply chain. He saw my silence as a lack of ambition. He saw my refusal to engage in his corporate posturing as proof that I was weak and uninspired. He never suspected that the aggressive competitor he cursed at during board meetings was actually the son he ridiculed at the dinner table. There is a specific kind of power in being underestimated. It's a cold, quiet strength that grows in the dark, away from the blinding glare of narcissism. My father's wealth was a house of cards built on the shifting sands of public perception and borrowed time. My wealth was built on code, precision, and the absolute refusal to be like him. He thought that by cutting off my access to the Sterling Trust, he was stripping me of my identity. He believed that without his signature on a check, I would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. It was almost poetic in its irony. He was so focused on the few million he thought he was withholding that he never bothered to look at the market share he was losing. I sat in my darkened apartment, the glow of my laptop screen the only light in the room. I opened the encrypted portal to my private accounts and watched the real-time valuation of my holdings. The contrast was staggering. I looked at the trust fund statement. It was empty. But my private portfolio? It was about to swallow his legacy whole. The morning after the gala, the world looked exactly the same to everyone else, but for me the air felt sharper. I was sitting in a small, nondescript coffee shop 3 blocks away from the Sterling Holdings headquarters, waiting for a man named Marcus. Marcus had been the head of internal audit for my father for nearly 20 years. He was the kind of man who lived for the decimal point, a quiet shadow who saw everything and said nothing. Until now. My father had fired him an hour after the gala ended, blaming Marcus for a clerical error. That was actually just my father's own overspending. It was the unforced error I had been waiting for. Marcus didn't come for revenge. He came for justice. He slid a thumb drive across the scarred wooden table and told me he couldn't live with the lies anymore. He told me that while my father was on stage calling me a burden, he was secretly drowning in a sea of red ink that went back nearly a decade. When I got home and plugged that drive in, the reality was far worse than even my most cynical projections. I spent hours scrolling through internal ledgers, tax filings, and hidden debt schedules that had been kept off the main books through a series of shell companies my father thought were clever. He wasn't just losing money. He was hemorrhaging it. The yachts, the gala, the vintage Bordeaux. It was all a frantic masquerade to keep the banks from looking too closely at the foundation. But the part that made my blood run cold was the leverage. My father hadn't just gambled with his own future. He had collateralized mine. I found the signatures on the 3rd subfolder. He had taken out massive personal loans to cover the operating losses of the main firm, and to secure those loans, he had put up the family estate, the house my mother had meticulously designed and loved. But he didn't stop there. He had found a loophole in the trust fund my grandfather had set up for me. By listing me as a non-active officer in one of his failing subsidiaries, he had managed to use the trust's principal as a guarantee for a revolving line of credit. He had drained the very thing he told the world he was gifting me. The trust fund wasn't empty because he had cut me off. It was empty because he had stolen it to pay for the illusion of his own success. I sat there in the silence of my office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses. The spreadsheet was a roadmap of narcissism. Every time the company took a hit, he didn't pivot or cut costs. He doubled down on his lifestyle to prove the haters wrong. He bought more prestige to mask more failure. There were entries for consulting fees that were actually just payments to his mistress's boutique, and travel expenses that covered 3-week vacations while his junior staff were being laid off without severance. He had been cannibalizing the family legacy for years, eating the future to satisfy the hunger of his ego in the present. The audit showed a man who was terrified of being seen as ordinary. He had spent my entire life making me feel small, so that I wouldn't notice how much he was shrinking. He called me a charity case because it was the only way he could live with the fact that he was the one living on borrowed time and stolen money. He had built a pedestal out of debt and expected me to worship him for it. I looked at the final tally of the liabilities, the interest rates that were set to balloon in 90 days, and the precarious stack of cross-collateralized assets that were one bad quarter away from a total collapse. He had spent 30 years building the Sterling name into a brand that stood for stability and power. In reality, it was now nothing more than a neon sign on a sinking ship. I realized then that his cutting me off wasn't a lesson in toughness. It was a desperate attempt to distance himself from the person who knew his business best before the walls finally caved in. He wanted me gone so I wouldn't be there to see the mask slip. He wanted to blame the eventual bankruptcy on the market or unforeseen circumstances, rather than his own incompetence. But he had waited too long to push me away. He had already given me the tools to understand exactly how he failed. He told me I was the family mistake, but the spreadsheet showed he was the one who had gambled away our last name. The transition from discovery to action was remarkably cold. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I felt the steady rhythmic pulse of a surgeon beginning a necessary operation. Through Viridian's capital and my own private holding firm, Apex Strategy, I began to move. My father's debt wasn't just a mountain of paper. It was a fragmented puzzle of high-interest loans held by boutique lenders who were starting to get nervous about his lack of liquidity. I didn't buy the company yet. I bought him. I started with his personal secondary lien, the one he'd taken out to fund the last 6 months of his image. By Tuesday, Apex Strategy owned the paper on his luxury fleet and his exclusive membership at the Heights, the country club that served as his personal throne room. I didn't wait. I triggered the immediate audit clause buried in the fine print of the default terms. Since the interest had technically lapsed 48 hours prior, I had the legal right to secure the assets. I watched from my balcony window, which overlooked the street, as the flatbed tow truck pulled up to the curb in front of his townhouse. The scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. My father burst through his front doors, still wearing his silk robe, waving a glass of scotch at the driver. He was screaming about administrative errors and clerical incompetence. From the street, I could hear him yelling that he was a founder, a titan of industry, and that someone's head would roll for this. The driver, a man who clearly didn't care about family legacies, just pointed to the clipboard and continued winching the custom Porsche 911 onto the bed. My father's face was a shade of purple I hadn't seen since his last boardroom meltdown. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was him. I didn't answer the first 3 times, letting the silence settle. When I finally picked up, I didn't say a word. I just listened to the sound of a man losing his grip. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize for the gala. He started screaming about the economic downturn and market fluctuations that were supposedly targeting him. He told me the banks were being predatory and that the world had gone mad. Then, as always, the venom turned toward me. He told me that if I had any spine at all, I'd be out looking for a job to help the family instead of sitting in my overpriced apartment, acting like a spectator. He called me a parasite. He told me that while he was out in the trenches fighting to keep the Sterling name alive, I was probably sleeping in and wasting the last of his generosity. He ranted about how he was the only one who understood the pressure of the top, and that a soft, entitled brat like me would never understand the sacrifices he was making. The irony was so thick it was nearly suffocating. He was standing on his sidewalk, humiliated in front of his neighbors, blaming a global conspiracy for the fact that he couldn't pay his car note. He was lecturing me on the value of hard work while I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the repossession certificates that had just hit my inbox for digital signature. I watched the tow truck pull away, taking his status symbol with it, leaving him standing there in the rain, looking small and defeated despite his loud voice. He hadn't realized that the predatory lender he was cursing was sitting 3 blocks away, listening to his every word. He thought the walls were closing in because of bad luck. He couldn't fathom that the son he had spent a lifetime belittling was the one holding the hammer. I listened to him tell me one last time that I was a loser who would never amount to anything before he slammed the phone down. I didn't even flinch. I just picked up my pen. He was still calling me a loser while I was literally signing the repossession orders for his Porsche. My father had always been a master of the public theater, but he had never played the role of the martyr quite so aggressively until his world began to shrink. By Wednesday evening, he had taken to social media to craft a narrative that was as fictional as his company's balance sheets. He posted a photo of himself sitting at his mahogany desk, the lighting dimmed to look like he was burning the midnight oil in a desperate struggle to keep the sterling legacy afloat. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive narcissism. He wrote about the heavy burden of leadership and the crushing loneliness of being a provider in a world full of takers. He didn't name me directly, he was too classy for that. But he spoke at length about the heartbreak of watching an ungrateful child turn their back on the family when things got tough. He called it a tragedy of the modern era, where the younger generation would rather watch a legacy burn than pick up a shovel and help dig. The reaction was instantaneous. Within minutes, the saint versus monster framing had taken hold of the extended family. My father had spent years cultivating the image of the benevolent patriarch, the man who paid for every Christmas dinner and handed out internships like candy. To them, he was the hero under siege. To them, I was the cold, distant son who had abandoned the man who gave him everything. My notifications began to explode with a rhythmic, mechanical hostility. It was the flying monkeys coming home to roost. First, it was Aunt Sarah, my father's youngest sister, who had lived off a consulting stipend from Sterling Holdings for a decade. She sent a 3-paragraph text calling me a selfish coward and reminding me that my father had paid for my private schooling while he was sacrificing his youth for the company. Then came my Uncle Robert, who lectured me on the sacred duty of the firstborn and told me that my mother would be ashamed to see me sitting on the sidelines while my father struggled. They didn't know about the empty trust fund. They didn't know about the repossession orders or the millions in hidden debt. They only knew the story my father told them, the story of a saintly builder being betrayed by a monster of his own making. I sat in the dark, the blue light of my phone illuminating the constant stream of vitriol. My inbox was a graveyard of family loyalty, filled with people I had known my entire life who were now lining up to take a swing at me to prove their allegiance to the man who held the purse strings. My father was even replying to the comments on his post with "God bless you for the support," and "It's a heavy cross to carry, but I'll keep fighting for the employees." He was leaning into the role of the tragic king, even as he was preparing to sell off the very employees he claimed to protect just to keep his own lights on for another month. The contrast was almost jarring. On one screen, I saw a community of people praising a man for his integrity and grit. On the other screen, I saw the forensic evidence of his theft, the proof that he had used these very people's names to secure loans he never intended to pay back. He was using his social capital to mask his financial insolvency, and it was working perfectly. The family was rallying around a ghost, protecting a fortress that had already been hollowed out from the inside. They saw a man standing tall. I saw a man using a megaphone to drown out the sound of the foundation cracking. My father sent me one final private message that night. It was a screenshot of his post, followed by a single line. "This is what people think of you. You're a footnote in my story, and soon you won't even be that." He wanted me to break. He wanted me to call him screaming and defensive, so he could record the call and show everyone how unstable I had become. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing me beg for a seat back at his table. He thought his public shaming was the ultimate weapon, a social death sentence that would leave me with nowhere to turn. He didn't realize that I had stopped caring about the family table the moment I realized it was built on a lie. I watched the comments pile up, the likes hitting the hundreds, the public consensus forming a wall against me. I felt a strange, detached peace. The more he leaned into his role as the martyr, the easier he was making my job. He was so busy performing for an audience of aunts and uncles that he wasn't watching the board. I didn't reply to the comments. I didn't need to. I was too busy preparing the letter of intent to buy his soul for pennies on the dollar. The silence of my apartment felt heavy as I opened the folder labeled Mother's Estate. This was the part of the audit that wasn't just about business. It was about a debt that had been accruing interest since I was 10 years old. My father had always told me that my mother left us with nothing but medical bills and heartache. He used that narrative to frame himself as the loan provider who had rescued me from a life of poverty. But as I looked at the original probate documents I'd spent months tracking down, the truth was a cold, jagged thing. My mother had left a substantial life insurance policy and a portfolio of blue-chip stocks specifically earmarked for my education and my future. My father had been the executor, a role he treated as a license to loot. I started a new spreadsheet. I titled it The Restitution. In the first column, I listed the life insurance payout from 2004. He had liquidated it 3 months after the funeral to buy a stake in a commercial development that eventually folded. He never told me. In the second column, I tracked the childhood earnings he'd managed for me. When I was 16, I had started a small web design business that took off locally. I was making more in a weekend than most adults made in a month. Because I was a minor, the accounts were in his name. I remembered him telling me he was putting it all into a long-term growth fund for my wedding one day. The spreadsheet showed a different story. Every penny of that business, my late nights, my missed social events, my genuine hard work, had been transferred out in small regular increments to pay for his club dues and his seasonal wardrobe updates. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting off the glass of water on my desk. I felt a hollow sort of clarity. He hadn't just used my money. He had systematically erased my contributions to the family's survival, so he could maintain the illusion that I was a parasite. The charity he bragged about at the gala was actually just him returning a fraction of the wealth he had stolen from me, rebranded as a gift to keep me submissive. It was a cycle of financial gaslighting that had lasted 2 decades. I dug deeper into the zero-value analysis. I calculated the interest that would have accrued on my mother's inheritance had it stayed in the diversified fund she intended. I added the inflation-adjusted value of my teenage business earnings. Then I added the management fees he had charged my trust fund for the privilege of him mismanaging it into the ground. I was clinical. I didn't add a cent for emotional distress or the years of verbal abuse. I kept it strictly to the receipts, the bank statements, and the legal mandates of an executor's fiduciary duty. I wanted a number that was indisputable, a number that a judge would look at and see as an objective fact of theft. The more I typed, the more the saint of Sterling Holdings began to look like a common thief in a bespoke suit. He had built his reputation on the backs of people who weren't allowed to see the books. He had spent years telling me I'd be nothing without his money, while the reality was that he would have been bankrupt before the age of 50 without mine. He was a hollow king sitting on a throne of stolen gold, and the audit was the sound of the floorboards rotting beneath him. I looked at the line items for family vacations that he had billed to my trust under the guise of educational travel. I saw the emergency loans he had granted himself from my mother's estate that were never repaid. Every entry was a small betrayal, a tiny puncture in the bond of a father and son. By the time I reached the bottom of the ledger, the numbers were staggering. It wasn't just a few $1,000s here and there. It was a systematic stripping of my personal and inherited assets to fuel a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own merit. He had called me a mistake at the gala, but I was the most profitable investment he'd ever made. I was his silent bank, his unwitting benefactor, and his scapegoat all rolled into one. I looked at the grand total at the bottom of the screen. It was highlighted in red, a stark reminder of what it had cost to be his son. I printed the sheet. The sound of the printer was the only noise in the room, a rhythmic thumping that felt like a countdown. I held the warm paper in my hands, reading the final figure over and over. This wasn't just a debt anymore. It was the leverage I needed to end his reign of arrogance. I had the letter of intent from Apex Strategy ready on the other monitor. The plan was simple. I would buy the remaining distressed debt of Sterling Holdings for 30 cents on the dollar, and then I would present him with this spreadsheet as the final payment for his exit. He wanted to cut me off? Fine. I was going to cut him out of the history of his own company. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. In 4 days, the board would meet to vote on the emergency investor I had manufactured through my holding company. He would be there, thinking he was being saved by a stranger. He wouldn't know the truth until the final signature was dry. The final number was $2.4 million. That was the price of his pride. And I had the check ready. The air in the Sterling Holdings boardroom was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and desperate relief. My father sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking more like his old self than he had in weeks. He had traded his silk robe for a charcoal pinstripe suit, his shoulders squared as if he had personally wrestled the ghost of bankruptcy to the ground and won. Surrounding him were the remaining board members, men and women who had spent years nodding at his every whim, now looking exhausted and eager for the miracle he had promised. He hadn't told them who the investor was, only that a firm called Apex Strategy had agreed to a massive capital infusion that would stabilize the firm and protect their seats. He was basking in the glow of his supposed resurrection, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he had already forgotten the tow trucks and the public humiliation of the previous week. I stood outside the heavy oak doors for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of his voice. He was telling the board that the recent turbulence was a minor setback caused by unreliable associates and market volatility, but that his leadership had secured a future for the sterling name. He even made a veiled joke about how some people are built for the storm and others just drown. That was my cue. I pushed the doors open. The heavy wood groaned on its hinges, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's smirk didn't vanish immediately. It curdled. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and genuine confusion, as if a stray dog had wandered into a cathedral. He didn't see a threat. He saw an interruption to his victory lap. He let out a sharp, condescending bark of a laugh and adjusted his tie, looking around the table to make sure the board members were sharing in the joke. He told me that I must have gotten lost on my way to the unemployment office. He said that this was a private meeting for stakeholders and grown-ups, who actually had skin in the game, not for children looking for another handout. I didn't say anything. I walked toward the table with a steady, deliberate pace. I could see the sweat starting to bead on his forehead despite his bravado. He stood up, slamming his hands onto the table, his face flushing that familiar shade of violent mahogany. He started shouting, telling me that he had warned me what would happen if I showed my face around the office again. He called for the security guard stationed by the door, his voice cracking with a high-pitched frantic energy that betrayed his internal panic. He told the guard to remove the trespasser, and to make sure I was barred from the building permanently. The board members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the guard took a tentative step toward me. I didn't stop. I walked right up to the empty chair directly opposite my father, the seat reserved for the lead investor. The guard reached for my arm, but I simply raised a hand, holding a single, notarized document from Apex Strategy. The guard stopped, looked at the document, and then looked at my father. He didn't move an inch further. My father was vibrating with rage now, his finger pointing at my face as he told the guard, "Get this nothing out of my sight right now before I have your job." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just placed my briefcase on the table, clicked the latches open, and slid the master acquisition file across the polished wood so it stopped right in front of his shaking hands. The room felt like it had been plunged into sub-zero temperatures. I looked him dead in the eye, seeing the moment the first spark of recognition finally hit him. The arrogance in his expression didn't just break. It evaporated, leaving behind the hollow, terrified shell of the man I had known my entire life. I just placed my briefcase on the table and said, "Actually, I'm the one who signs your paycheck now." The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It was clinical. My father sat back down, his legs seemingly unable to support the weight of his collapsing ego. He looked at the document on the table as if it were a poisonous reptile. He began to stammer, calling for his lead counsel, a man named Henderson who had been the family's legal attack dog for decades. Henderson stepped forward, his spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, and picked up the filing. I watched his eyes dart across the lines, moving from the Apex Strategy logo to the signature at the bottom. The color drained from his face in a way that felt more satisfying than any shout could have been. He looked at my father, then back at me, and slowly closed the folder. My father started demanding that Henderson fix this clerical error and remove this delusional boy from the premises. He turned to the representative from the bank, a vice president named Miller who had spent every Thanksgiving dinner for the last 5 years ignoring my existence or making snide comments about my lack of corporate hunger. Miller had always been my father's shadow, a man who measured worth by the thickness of a portfolio. He stepped toward the table, his mouth opening to deliver what I assumed would be a biting dismissal. But as Miller looked at the verified proof of funds and the transfer of the distressed debt notes, his entire posture changed. It was a physical transformation. His shoulders slumped, his chest retracted, and the arrogant tilt of his chin vanished. He didn't look at my father. He looked at me with a terrifyingly subservient focus. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and raspy in the hushed room. He told my father, in a voice that didn't shake but lacked all its former warmth, that the documents were legitimate. He confirmed that Apex Strategy had successfully executed a hostile takeover by acquiring 100% of the defaulted senior debt and 40% of the common stock. My father let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He started shouting that it was impossible, that a kid couldn't command that kind of capital. He looked to Henderson for a lifeline, but the lawyer wouldn't meet his gaze. Henderson was too busy adjusting his tie and offering me a polite, deferential nod. The validation from these third parties, the very men who had helped my father build his wall of exclusivity, was the final nail. They weren't just confirming a business transaction. They were officially recognizing the shift in the food chain. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted. Miller, the man who had once told me I'd be lucky to get a job in the mailroom, actually bowed his head slightly as he handed me the corporate seal. He asked me if I would like him to call a recess so I could settle in, his voice dripping with a newfound sycophantic respect. My father watched this play out in a state of catatonic shock. He was seeing the world he built flip its allegiance in real time. He realized that the men he thought were his loyal soldiers were actually just mercenaries, and they had just spotted a higher bidder. The look on the lawyer's face said everything. He wasn't looking at a disappointing son anymore. He was looking at the new king. I didn't offer him a chair, and I didn't offer him a drink. I simply opened the second folder in my briefcase, the one containing the forensic breakdown of the last 20 years. The board members and the lawyers had filed out of the room at my silent gesture, leaving only the two of us in a space that used to be his sanctuary. The mahogany table felt like an ocean between us. My father didn't look like a titan anymore. He looked like a man who had been caught in a lie and was frantically trying to remember which version of the story he was supposed to tell. I didn't give him the chance to speak. I began to read the formal termination notice. I cited gross negligence, the breach of fiduciary duty, and the systematic embezzlement of funds under the guise of corporate expenses. His reaction followed the exact trajectory I had anticipated. At first, the monster tried to claw its way back to the surface. He slammed his fist on the table and told me I couldn't fire him from a company that carried his name. He called me a traitor and a thief, his voice echoing off the glass walls. But as I flipped through the pages of the audit, showing him the exact dates he had dipped into my mother's estate and the specific accounts he had drained to pay for his club memberships, the fire in him died out. The transition was pathetic. His posture collapsed, his lip began to tremble, and he pivoted instantly into the pitiful victim. He started talking about the pressure of the business. He told me that everything he did to keep a roof over my head and to maintain the sterling standard that I enjoyed. He actually had the nerve to say that he only borrowed the money because he knew I'd want to help the family if I only understood the stakes. He started to weep thick and theatrical tears, asking how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. He begged me to think of the legacy, to think of his reputation, and to realize that at his age, he had nowhere else to go. He reached across the table, his hand shaking, trying to touch my sleeve as if a physical connection could bridge the chasm of 2 decades of abuse. I didn't move. I waited for him to finish his performance, then I slid the $2.4 million bill across the table. I told him that I wasn't just firing him, I was holding him personally liable for the restitution of the funds he had misappropriated from my mother's estate and my own childhood earnings. I told him that the price of his silence and a graceful retirement, without criminal charges, was his immediate resignation and the forfeiture of his remaining personal assets. The spreadsheet was a cold, hard ceiling that he couldn't break through. He looked at the total, the $2.4 million, and I could see the realization hitting him that he was truly mathematically broke. He looked around the room, at the awards on the walls and the view of the city. He thought he conquered, and he finally understood that he was an intruder in his own life. The man who had spent 30 years telling me that I was nothing without him was now standing in a room where he owned nothing, controlled nothing, and was nothing. The power he had used as a bludgeon had been stripped away, leaving only the hollow core of a person who had never actually built anything that wasn't stolen. He looked at me, his eyes red and searching for a flicker of the soft kid he used to bully, but he found nothing but a reflection of his own coldness. He picked up the pen with a hand that looked 20 years older than it had an hour ago. He signed the resignation and the transfer of assets in a jagged, desperate scrawl. When he was finished, he stood there, clutching his briefcase like a life raft, looking at the door as if he didn't know how to walk through it without a title. He asked me in a voice that was barely a whisper, what he was supposed to do now. He asked where he was supposed to go with no house, no car, and a reputation that was about to be dismantled by the morning news cycle. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I had spent my life studying while he was busy admiring himself. I didn't feel the surge of joy I thought I would. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally being settled. I didn't turn around to look at him one last time. I just spoke into the silence of the room, using the same dismissive tone he had used on me 1,000 times before. I told him what he told me. Toughen up. It's a cold world out there. The renovation of the lobby took 3 weeks, but the change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The gold-plated letters spelling out Sterling Holdings were the first things to go, melted down and sold to cover the back wages of the custodial staff my father had ignored for months. In their place, a simple, elegant sign was mounted in brushed steel. The Eleanor Foundation. I stood in the center of the atrium, watching the morning sun hit my mother's name. It wasn't just a rebranding, it was an exorcism. The building no longer felt like a monument to one man's fragile ego. It felt like a place where work actually got done. I had cleared the rot, settled the debts, and restructured the firm into a lean, tech-driven powerhouse that didn't need a charismatic tyrant to stay afloat. I spent my first Sunday of true peace in my new office, which used to be my father's. I had replaced the heavy, dark furniture with something light and functional. The air felt easier to breathe. There were no frantic phone calls from creditors, no screaming matches over missed projections, and no toxic family members clogging my inbox with demands for loyalty. Most of the aunts and uncles had vanished the moment the checks stopped clearing, proving that their love for the patriarch was just as leveraged as his company. I didn't miss them. I had finally learned that silence isn't a sign of loneliness. It's the sound of a life that belongs entirely to you. I thought back to that night at the gala, to the moment my father raised his glass and told a room full of strangers that I was nothing. At the time, it was meant to be the ultimate insult, a way to strip me of my humanity. But looking out over the city now, I realized that being nothing in his eyes was the greatest gift he ever gave me. Because I was nothing to him, I was free to become something he couldn't predict, categorize, or control. I had built a kingdom in his blind spot while he was busy staring at his own reflection. My dad always said I'd be nothing without his money. He was right. Because without his money, I became the person who took it all back. And I'm just getting started.